if you had some sort of policy where they said, look, we are going to, incentivize new production as quickly as possible and longer term as possible, I do think that would be one of the more productive uses of public capital. I mean, if you're gonna, yeah, if your choices are either throw, billions of dollars towards corporations for frivolous purposes or throw billions of dollars towards energy development, I would take that latter one every day of the week, right? So that's not the worst use of incentives or public capital. And basically, if the U.S. said, look, if prices go below X, we will expand our strategic petroleum reserve to pay you X. So you have no kind of downside risk over the next 5 years from producing oil. I think I mean, that probably you'd have periods of problem in the future. You might have oversupply at some point, right? That's kind of the history of public arrangements where they solve one problem, they create another. But I do think that is one of the solutions here. But I think this is overall it's just going to be a very challenging decade. I think different countries are going to handle it differently. I think some of them might try to do things like that. Other times, I think the private sector can wake up and if we kind of get out of their way, that they can go and do that. And it's of course it's a very challenging balance because during this period of commodity oversupply, that's when a lot of people develop some of these environmental goals that they then are stuck because now you have an actual crisis and you're balancing between the environmental goals you were kind of planning for and then being hit in the face by the real world. And I think that's it. Just I think a lot of people are kind of adjusting and kind of navigating that in the way that they see it.
Really quick question before we kind of just summarize everything. Food, or excuse me, energy, oil, these like energy markets are at this epicenter of everything, but then like downstream of that immediately becomes food. Can you just kind of paint the picture of what is the state of fertilizer markets and just food markets, and if there's any just like, contagion risk there?
So there are so I mean, a subset of fertilizers are made using natural gas, right? So energy is a key input, not just in driving to work, but also in making food. And then even once the food is made, in terms of transporting it and packaging it and getting it to where it needs to be, all that is a very energy intensive process. And so generally when you have price spikes in energy, that translates into price spikes in food, which of course is one of the most bad types of inflation because it's an essential good and it hurts impoverished people the most because they spend the largest percentage of their income on necessities like food and fuel. Um, and then it's compounded by the fact, I mean, so Russia's the biggest fertilizer exporter, first of all. And so there's obviously, we think of Russia as an oil exporter, but they're actually they're the second biggest oil exporter. They're the biggest natural gas exporter. They're the biggest fertilizer exporter. They're a big exporter of nickel, which is an important metal for batteries and things like that. So a lot of the renewables that people want to do, they have sources there. So they're given the fact of the largest land mass, it's not shocking that they're basically the most important commodity market. And so that obviously has some geopolitical implications. But either way, basically, so Russia's a big fertilizer exporter. They're also a big wheat exporter. Ukraine's a big wheat exporter. And so I know that Ukraine's harvest has obviously been disrupted from this. So you've had kind of wheat problems. And if you look actually at a wheat chart, there is a sign of good there. So you had this huge spike during the run up to the war, but it's actually given back a lot of those war related gains because I think that might be cooling off to some extent. But over the very long run, I think the key thing to focus on is fertilizer because if natural gas prices stay high, that means fertilizer prices are likely to stay high, which translates into higher food prices. And like I said, transporting it. Now, again, you do have a supply response over time. And so, for example, one of the world's largest fertilizer producers, Nutrien, is expanding their production. They were kind of on the fence for that for a number of years, where they always had the option to maybe expand it. Now they're kind of accelerating some of their expansion efforts because the market has given them the signal, yes, we need all this new production. And so I think that over time you can get responses to that. But it just, commodity cycles tend to be rather persistent. They tend to last, 5 to 10 years on the upside and 5 to 10 or more years on the downside because a lot of these projects do take years to bring online. And so I think that is the big challenge right now is that you have so much debt in the system, increased money supply so much. Now we have real world constraints on energy and fertilizer and things like that. And so I think we're going to have a period of high inflation, interest rates below inflation, and to the extent that it's either bad or terrible, it really comes down to the real world, right? So can we get the energy? Can we get the fertilizer? Can we get that? Who's going to get it? And I think that's the situation we find ourselves in.